Hello, class, and welcome to Deviance and Psychopathological Perspectives. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and I will be your instructor for this course. I'm delighted to welcome you to the course of Deviance and Psychopathological Perspectives. And over the next several weeks and months, we will explore really the intricate interplay between human development and psychopathology, and hopefully shed some light on the various aspects of deviance and its psychological underpinnings. Now, as we begin today, I want to just explore a little bit of the realm of developmental psychopathology as a field in general, and then examine how atypical development can lead to various psychological disorders. And we'll also dive in a little bit into our understanding of deviance, as well as psychopathology and their dynamic interrelationship throughout the lifespan. So, as we look at this course, we're going to first off dive in a little bit into a historical figure, and I like to do that with every lecture. Highlight one significant person that is important for understanding the field. We'll then also look at the fundamentals of deviance and try to define deviance and examine the different types of deviant behaviors. And then we'll look a little bit at what is psychopathology and try to define that a little bit, how it's been used over time, try to understand its significance in contemporary psychology. So I encourage you to engage in this lecture, to do your own research, and to critically consume this information. Now, I want to start off as we dive into this landscape of psychopathology to look at and acknowledge a pioneer in the field, someone who has laid the foundation for our understanding of human mind and for the ways that the human mind can vary and change and sometimes go wrong. So I want to introduce you to Emil Kraepelin, and he was a German psychiatrist born in 1856, and is really a central figure in the history of psychopathology. He had some real groundbreaking work that laid the groundwork for things like classification and the understanding of mental illnesses. And Kraepelin's impact in the field is especially evident in his development of the whole concept of psychiatric nosology, that is the systematic classification of mental disorders. And Kraepelin's most notable contribution really lies in his dichotomy of psychiatric disorders into two major groups. The first one being what has been called dementia praecox, and what we now kind of think of this as schizophrenia, and the other one being manic depressive illnesses, now termed as bipolar. And this categorical approach marked a departure from earlier, less systematic classification systems. Now, unlike many of his contemporaries, Kraepelin emphasized the importance of empirical observation and, of course, scientific rigor in understanding mental disorders. And so his meticulous documentation of clinical cases and systematic analysis really kind of laid the groundwork for our modern understanding of psychopathology and indeed for psychiatric research methodologies in general. And Kraepelin really emphasized the course and the outcome of mental disorders. And this was really revolutionary because he conducted some extensive longitudinal studies where he documented the progression of illnesses over time. And this approach really contributed to a more dynamic and really comprehensive understanding of psychopathology and mental illness. And so understanding Kraepelin's work is really crucial as it serves as a cornerstone, a shift in the way that historically we have viewed mental illness. And so I want you to kind of keep him in mind and other groundbreaking theorists like him as we go through this course, and consider your place in the history of developmental psychopathology. What can you contribute to this field as well? Now, let's go on and explore a little bit of defining deviance and examine some of the different types of deviant behavior that can serve as touchstones for our understanding of psychopathology. Now, we can really kind of think of deviance within the context of psychology as referring to the behaviors and thoughts or emotions that significantly depart from social norm or cultural norms and expectations. And it's important to note that the concept of deviance really is something that's relative and it's context dependent. And so it's going to vary across cultures and across subcultures and across societies, and indeed depending upon the historical period within which you live. Now, a few examples of what we can call deviant behavior. One of the obvious ones of social deviance would be antisocial behavior. Antisocial behavior really encompasses actions that harm or have a lack of consideration for the rights of others. And this category includes not just criminal activities, but, deceitfulness, impulsivity, and a basic lack of remorse. And then there's mood disorders. And these are really deviations in emotional states that can, in some ways be considered deviant. For instance, persistent and extreme alterations in mood, such as prolonged periods of intense sadness or depression, or episodes of unwarranted euphoria, what we call mania, fall under the umbrella of deviant emotional behavior. And then there can be, even deviations in eating habits that significantly impact one's physical or mental well-being. Things like anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa are examples of deviant behavior within the realm of mental health. And even the misuse of substances, including, of course, alcohol and drugs, leads to detrimental effects on physical health, mental well-being, and social functioning. And so this is a form of deviant behavior as well. And so understanding deviance really is a crucial lens through which we examine psychopathology. And it allows us to recognize when behavior falls outside the norm and explore the underlying psychological processes contributing to such deviations. Now, let's explore a little bit of, what do we mean by psychopathology, and dive in a little bit into the historical applications of our understanding of the complexities of human behavior. So we can think of psychopathology as in terms of the scientific study of mental disorders. And this would include things like their development, their classification, and even their treatment. And it involves examining manifestations of psychological distress, mental dysfunction, really any atypical behavior that significantly impairs an individual's well-being or their daily functioning. Now, historically, deviations in behavior were often interpreted through the lens of morality or the supernatural lens. And so individuals exhibiting unusual behavior were considered to be morally corrupt, for example, or to be possessed by malevolent forces. And psychopathology, as a scientific discipline, emerged to really move away from such subjective and stigmatizing interpretations. And the 19th century saw then a shift towards what we would call the medical model. And this medical model really started to revolutionize our understanding of mental disorders. And so people like Emil Kraepelin And the work of people like Emil Kraepelin to reveal that psychopathology can be viewed as an illness with biological underpinnings really paved the way for more scientific and empirical approaches to the diagnosis, the understanding, and the treatment of these disorders. Now, of course, you can't really talk about anything to do with mental illness without talking a little bit about Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory is something that significantly influenced psychopathology by emphasizing the role of the unconscious processes in shaping behavior. And so his work laid the groundwork for understanding the psychological roots of various disorders, opening new avenues for therapeutic interventions. And then we have a shift. And so Sigmund Freud kind of took up really the first half of the 20th century. But about midway through the 20th century, we saw the rise of behaviorism and the expanded understanding of cognitive psychology. And so this, again, contributed a fresh perspective to psychopathology. Here we have behaviorists focusing upon observable behaviors, while cognitive psychologists explored the role of thought processes in mental health. And these two paradigms getting married together really enrich our understanding of how environmental and cognitive factors influence psychopathological phenomena. And we'll see how this plays itself out in effective therapies later on. So when we talk about developmental psychopathology or developmental psychology, and this is kind of how this course will be kind of framed around, is looking at different psychological problems at different stages in life. And so developmental psychology, we can think of it as the scientific study of how an individual changes over time. And, this is going to include their physical change, their cognitive change, their emotional and social aspects of development, right from conception all the way to death. And this provides an understanding of the processes and factors that influence behavior at different stages of life. And there's some general insights that we can get from developmental psychology. Of course, the first one would be the nature versus nurture debate. And developmental psychology really investigates the interplay between our genetic factors, nature, and the environmental factors, the nurture. And so understanding this dynamic helps us appreciate the complex origins of behavior and of psychopathology in general. And it's always important to be mindful that in the development of a person, there are critical periods, there are sensitive periods, and the whole concept of critical periods highlights specific times in development when an individual is particularly susceptible to certain environmental influences. And these sensitive times, while less rigid, suggest times when individuals are more responsive to certain experiences. So both notions contribute to our comprehension of how timing can shape developmental outcomes. And of course, there's that whole idea of continuity and discontinuity in the stages. There's some flow, but still some distinction in this. And developmental psychologists really want to explore whether development is a continuous, gradual process, or if it's marked by distinct stages and transitions. And while this debate is a healthy one, I'm going to highlight some of the distinct stages that take place in different times. And of course, it's important to also understand the formation of attachments in early childhood and the development of social skills in early childhood, because this sheds some light on the foundation of interpersonal relationships. And so deviations in these very critical processes can have implications in the development of psychopathology throughout the lifespan. And we also, of course, need to recognize the role of culture and having a healthy, supportive culture in shaping cognitive processes. And also the role of things like social norms and expectations that are crucial in this process. And so developmental psychology acknowledges that there is diversity in human experience, and it really highlights the impact of cultural context on psychological development as part of this overall process of a person growing and changing and developing over time. Now, having covered all of that, the real core of this course is in terms of the developmental psychopathology. And that really is kind of a specialized field within psychology that examines the development of psychological disorders across the lifespan. And so we're going to investigate how biological and psychological and social factors interact to influence the onset, the course, and outcomes of various mental health conditions. And developmental psychopathology really recognizes that individuals with similar early experiences may follow very diverse developmental paths. There's a term called multifinality, which really kind of refers to the different outcomes arising from similar beginnings. And that's a little bit different from equifinality, which suggests that similar outcomes may stem from a diverse early experiences. And then, of course, we need to also be mindful and identify risk factors as well as protective factors in creating a healthy individual. There are elements that increase or decrease the likelihood of developing a psychological disorder. And so we need to explore those and find insights for prevention as well as intervention strategies for people throughout the lifespan. There's also the whole concept of resilience, which examines why some individuals, despite facing adversity, maintain positive mental health. And so understanding resilience really informs strategies to promote mental well-being, even in the face of challenging circumstances. And developmental psychopathology also considers the impact of psychological disorders on the accomplishment of age-appropriate developmental tasks. For example, how disruption in cognitive development during childhood can affect things like academic achievement. We'll also explore examining how individuals navigate the transitional periods. So, for example, the transition into adolescence or encountering major life events during that transition into adolescence can have profound critical impact upon them. And so we'll explore a little bit of that and what are some vulnerable times and how this can lead to the emergence of psychopathology. And of course, as always, we want to acknowledge the cultural and contextual influences on developmental psychopathology. The field itself recognizes that norms and expectations are going to vary across cultures, and the impact of psychopathology must be understood within specific social context. So by adopting a developmental psychopathology lens, we gain a nuanced understanding of the dynamic interplay between the development of the individual and possible development of psychopathology. So overall, I do want to, I think it's important to highlight a few basic things within this. a person never exists apart from their physical self. And so thoughts and feelings and emotions are physically based, but the thoughts, feelings, and emotions and behaviors can also impact the functioning of the physical. And that includes the brain structure. And so I want to lay some groundwork for understanding the brain and how it contributes to the complexities of human development and psychopathology. So just a few basic comments on key things to be mindful of within the brain and the brain structure. The first one is, at the core of brain function is the neuron, the fundamental building block of the nervous system. And neurons transmit information through electrical and chemical signals, and they form these very specific networks that underlie all cognitive and behavioral processes. And within the brain is specialized and divided into distinct regions, and each region is responsible for specific functions. For example, the frontal lobe governs decision-making and personality. The temporal lobe is involved in auditory processing, and the limbic system plays a crucial role in emotions and memory. And so overall, you can kind of think of ourselves as the conscious and the unconscious. The conscious part is just that thin external layer, the cerebral cortex, that outer layer of the brain. And that is particularly vital for our higher cognitive functions. And it's divided into lobes, and each continues to have various responsibilities, from perception to thought to action to coordination. And within the cerebral cortex, that is our conscious self as we think of ourselves. But underneath that are the unconscious self, which is extremely important. And those are the subcortical structures. So beneath the cerebral cortex lie these subcortical structures, including our hippocampus, which is associated with memory, and our amygdala, which links to emotions, and our thalamus, which relays sensory information. And these structures play integral roles in shaping our behavioral responses. And of course, there isn't just one person in our head, there's at least two, because our brain is divided into two hemispheres. Each is responsible for controlling the opposite side of the body, which is lateralization. So while lateralization exists, with certain functions being more dominant in one hemisphere, both hemispheres collaborate for integrated cognitive processes. And we need to also be mindful that there are neural pathways that facilitate communication between the different brain regions. So we have axons that transmit signals over synapses and the junctions between neurons. And understanding these pathways is crucial for comprehending how information flows within the brain. Now, we also need to be mindful that while the brain largely is set in adulthood, the brain does exhibit some plasticity, that there is some limited ability for it to reorganize itself and to respond to experiences. And so there's a quality that is especially pronounced during the developmental years, where the brain is literally shaped in a structure, and its function is based upon the environmental stimuli that it receives. And so we need to always be mindful of that, of course. Then there is, of course, the neurochemistry, the neurotransmitters that facilitate the communication that goes on. And these neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that facilitate communication between the neurons. And so these molecules transmit signals across synapses, those little tiny gaps between the neurons. And this is influences various physiological and psychological processes. And I'm just going to highlight a few because these are the ones that will be most important within this course. The first one is dopamine, and dopamine is associated with reward and pleasure. And dopamine plays a role in motivation and mood and motor control. And then there's serotonin. Serotonin really, it doesn't make you feel happy, but it makes you feel safe. And if you feel safe, that's kind of a precursor to feeling happy. So serotonin is involved in a lot of regulation. It's involved in sleep and appetite. So serotonin does a lot of things, but in essence, it's crucial in emotional well-being. So in order to really feel calm and at peace, you need serotonin. Then there's norepinephrine, and this contributes to our alertness and our arousal and really influences our fight or flight response. It's the one that gets us, it's adrenaline, basically. And so we need to kind of think in terms of this. And then there's GABA, also known as gamma-aminobutyric acid. And this really acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, calming down all our neural activity and promoting relaxation. And this is really extreme. This isn't just a sense of calm, but this is kind of calming everything down almost to the point of losing consciousness. And then there's glutamate, and glutamate functions as a general excitatory neurotransmitter, facilitating neural communication and synaptic plasticity. So glutamate, is the one that kind of keeps us conscious in many ways. And so one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that each of these neurotransmitters, and there are many, many more neurotransmitters, but these are just the big players in the picture, are to be found in perfect balance, literally perfect balance. And so any imbalances in neurotransmitter levels can cause various mental disorders. For example, reduced serotonin levels are associated with conditions like depression, while disruptions in dopamine transmission are linked to things like schizophrenia. So, the other thing to kind of be mindful of is that neurotransmitters are created, but then they're taken up and broken down into different things. And so there's a whole system of reuptake and enzymatic breakdown that takes place within the brain. And so after neurotransmitters do their job and transmit their signals, they can be reabsorbed by the sending neuron. That is called a process called reuptake, or they can be broken down by enzymes. And medications that want to help your brain find a balance target these processes in order to treat specific psychiatric disorders that might have neurotransmitters as a component of them. We also need to be mindful that neurotransmitters are hormones that play a crucial role in regulation of behavior and mood. And so the endocrine system includes glands like the hypothalamus and pituitary. These also release hormones that have profound influences on various bodily functions. But there's also life outside of the body, and stress from the environment can cause our body to react. And so there's this interplay between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and that's very evident in the stress response. So stress triggers the release of hormones, let's say cortisol, which impacts neural activity and potentially contributes over time to psychopathological outcomes. While cortisol is a helpful hormone, it can, if in too long and too great quantities, can be really neurotoxic. There's also in this whole process, we're talking a lot about biology. One of the foundations of biology is genetics. And so genetic factors can influence things like the synthesis or the release or the reception of neurotransmitters. And so understanding the genetic basis of neurochemical processes is really essential for unraveling the complexities of psychopathology. And so the other thing to kind of be mindful of, and that we will explore throughout this course, are the psychotropic medications that target these systems. Things like antidepressants or antipsychotics often target these neurotransmitter systems, and they really aim to restore balance and alleviate the symptoms associated with various mental disorders. So psychopharmacological medications are not something to be dismissed. They play a crucial role in our care for people that are suffering from psychopathology. Now, I want to kind of just explore a little bit of developmental psychopathology in early childhood, because this really kind of involves the study of atypical psychological development and behavioral patterns and emotional experiences in children up to around the age of 6 for early childhood. And so the aim is to really identify deviations in typical developmental strategies and trajectories and understand the factors that contribute to such deviations. So I'm going to use ADHD as an example in early childhood because it's a hugely prevalent one. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's characterized by persistent patterns of inattention and hyperactivity and impulsivity that significantly impairs and interferes with daily functioning. And so there are some early signs and symptoms, things like inattention, that is, difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or in play activities, and being easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, or forgetting in doing daily activities. That's one example. There's also hyperactivity. So this would be things like excessive fidgeting or squirming, or the inability to stay seated or situated where they're expected to be, and someone who talks excessively or has difficulty engaging in quiet activities. And then, of course, there's impulsivity. That is the idea of acting without thinking about the consequences. Someone who has difficulty waiting their own turn, or interrupting or intruding on others' conversations or games. And so, using this as an example, there are a few neurobiological things that we should think about, as well as developmental considerations that we should be thinking about in something like this. So from the neurobiological perspective, we can kind of think in terms of there's probably an imbalance involving things like dopamine and norepinephrine that are often implicated in ADHD. There can also be some structural differences in brain regions associated with attention and impulse control, such as the prefrontal cortex, and these can contribute to the disorder. There's also likely some developmental considerations that we should be mindful of here. So, for example, early identification and early intervention can really be crucial for mitigating the long-term impact of ADHD, particularly upon academic and social functioning. And you need to kind of remember that the brain is plastic, and so there is some, particularly in the early years, with appropriate interventions, we can mitigate a lot of the consequences that can come from a disorder like this. We also, of course, need to be mindful of the role of genetic factors and environmental factors, including things like prenatal exposure to substances, as well as parenting practices that sometimes can be significant contributors to development of ADHD. Now, I want to also now turn a little bit to the middle and late childhood This too can be a critical phase in human development. So here we're thinking in terms of ages 6 through to 12. This is a period of significant cognitive and social and emotional development, and developmental psychopathology in this stage really examines the deviations from typical developmental patterns and behaviors that may signal the onset of a psychological disorder. So we can think in terms here of, say for example, generalized anxiety disorder. Now, anxiety disorder in middle childhood really encompasses a range of conditions characterized by things like excessive worry, fear, or apprehension, and this really often interferes with the child's daily life. And some things to look for here are, the child with generalized anxiety disorder. They may experience persistent or excessive worry about various aspects of life, such as school performance and family issues, or even personal safety. They can often exhibit physical symptoms like headaches or stomach aches or other physical symptoms without any apparent medical cause. There can be a strong desire to be perfect and an inclination to over-prepare for events, even minor events. And there can be a sense of restlessness and fatigue and irritability, and these are common manifestations of a child's ability, and this really impacts on the child's ability to concentrate and participate in daily activities. And again, we need to think of this in terms of developmental considerations and neurobiological ones. So from the neurobiological perspective, there can oftentimes be an imbalance, particularly with things like serotonin or GABA, the gamma-aminobutyric acid, which can be implicated in anxiety disorders. As far as the brain structures goes, the amygdala is obviously a crucial one in emotional processing, and so this can show heightened activity in children with anxiety disorders. And then as far as the developmental considerations, we need to kind of be mindful that middle childhood is a period of increased cognitive abilities. And this allows children to better articulate and understand their anxieties, but also allows them to think more deeply about potential anxieties. So some identification and intervention and helping a child navigate cognitively the logic of some of their anxieties can go a long way to significantly impacting the long-term mental health of a child in their middle years. So some basic conversations and being open to children of this age by adults can go a long ways to impacting their mental health. Now, we can also, of course, take a look at late childhood. And we can think in terms of the age spanning 9 through to 12, and characterized again by some significant cognitive and emotional and social development. And, we can think in terms of something like obsessive compulsive disorder, which is a condition that is characterized by persistent intrusive thoughts, the obsessions, and repetitive behaviors or mental acts, which would be the compulsions. And so for children with OCD, they may experience intrusive thoughts or images that cause significant distress. These can be common fears of contamination, harm coming to oneself or someone else, or the fear of making a mistake. And there can be compulsions that go along with this that help alleviate the anxiety triggered by the obsessions, and children may engage in compulsive behaviors or rituals, and these can be things like ritual counting or ritual checking of a particular thing, like turning off a light or excessive hand washing. And this can all, of course, impact the child's daily activities, their social interactions, their academic performance, because they can be very time-consuming to be engaging in compulsions that may result in difficulties completing other everyday tasks. And something also that you will find with children with OCD is that they may avoid situations that trigger their obsessions, leading to limitations in their activities and into their social engagements. And again, we can think in terms of the neurobiology of this, because oftentimes there's a dysregulation of serotonin here that particularly has to do with the basal ganglia region, which is involved in motor control and compulsive behavior. And from the developmental consideration, late childhood marks, this period of increased self-awareness and social comparison, and this can potentially intensify the impact of OCD-related symptoms. So, early intervention, as always, combined with some cognitive behavioral therapy and potentially some medications, can go a long way to help a child heal and overcome these OCD symptoms. There is, of course, the key stage that we always think about when we think in terms of developmental psychopathology, and that is adolescence. Adolescence is a crazy time. It is Sturm und Drang, as one historical psychologist would say, which is the storm and stress of life. In adolescence, we can think of this, ages 12 through to 18. Really, adolescence you can think of it psychologically as extending even further. But it's marked by the rapid physical, cognitive, and socio-emotional changes that take place. And so things like depression can become very prevalent at this stage. And, depression as a mood disorder is characterized by persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness and a lack of interest or pleasure in daily activities. And an adolescent with this can feel like they're in a prolonged low mood, and they may manifest irritability and sadness, just a general sense of emptiness in life. And, what's the point of it all? And this can lead to social isolation, a decline in peer relationships. It can result in alterations in sleep patterns, have either lack of sleep or excessive sleep, changes in appetite leading to weight gain or weight loss, poor academic performance, difficulties in concentrating and memory, ultimately affecting the academic performance. And in severe cases, this can lead to significant self-harm, suicidal ideation, and perhaps suicide. And again, the neurobiological, we need to kind of be mindful of that, because that's kind of the basis of who we are. And in adolescence, particularly in this kind of condition, you can see a disruption in serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine. You can see emotional dysregulation associated with the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And so in the midst of this, you have hormone changes as well as increased peer influences and heightened self-awareness. So, of course, there's going to be a high vulnerability here. And so we need to be mindful of this, particularly at this stage in life, to engage in early interventions, psychotherapy, medications, whatever the individual needs to manage through this and improve their outcomes with things like depression. And of course, it isn't just adolescents that suffer from depression. Adults suffer from depression as well. And so we can think in terms of major depressive disorder in adults, anybody over the age of 20. This is a very common problem, and we will touch on this again and again within this course, because this is a big one that you will be dealing with on a regular basis. This is typified by pervasive low mood, persistent pervasive feelings of sadness and emptiness, and perhaps guilt and hopelessness, And this is going to impact their overall mood and outlook on life. And the hallmark of things like major depressive disorder is a diminished interest or pleasure in activities that they once enjoyed. So hobbies and social interactions and work-related activities, they just kind of lose their appeal. Again, there can be changes in sleep and appetite. There can be fatigue and lack of energy, even when just minimal exertion is taking place. And there could be cognitive impairments, difficulties concentrating, memory, difficulty in making decisions. And again, neurotransmitters are essentially important here. You have disruptions often in serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. You have structural issues that perhaps can be happening in the brain with mood regulation, with the hippocampus and the amygdala. And so this can have significant impacts upon careers, upon relationship dynamics, upon caregiving responsibilities. And all of this can exacerbate or be exacerbated by major depressive disorder. And so intervention, again, is key. And I hope you see here that intervention across all the stages of life is absolutely important. And even when we journey into the later phases of life, into adulthood, we don't get away from these types of things. So typically at the age of 65 and later, there are also issues that can arise. For example, dementia. Dementia is a neurocognitive disorder characterized by a decline in cognitive function, particularly affecting memory, but also affects reasoning and communication and the ability to just carry out daily activities. The number one thing people think of, though, is, of course, the significant impact upon memory loss. And this can affect recent events and, in advanced stages, even long-term memories. And so the individuals with dementia, they may also struggle with verbal or written communication. They have difficulty finding the right words, of repeating phrases, or having challenges in understanding others. And so there can also be difficulties with the executive function within the mind. Planning and organizing and problem solving can also become very difficult parts of this. There can be mood swings, irritability, changes in emotional regulation. And dementia is progressive. And so the individual will face challenges that increasingly require assistance. Now, with dementia, again, we need to remember that our mind is biologically based in our brain, and so there can be structural changes. There's, for example, an abnormal protein that develops called things like beta amyloid plaques, and tau tangles can cause neuronal death in certain parts, typically in the subcortical regions to start with, and then spreading out from there. And there can also be, of course, with that, neurotransmitter imbalances. So acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter essential for formation of memories, and that is implicated in cognitive decline. And so there needs to be some intervention to provide health and support for individuals living with dementia. And we need to recognize that no matter the stage of life, that psychopathology can occur. There is no stage of life when a person is guaranteed to be free of psychopathology. And so as caring professionals, we need to recognize that psychopathology happens throughout the lifespan. So, in this course of deviance and psychopathological perspectives across the lifespan, I hope that you recognize that there are many things that we can do. So I want to kind of end with highlighting a few key terms. Deviance. What do we mean by deviance? So this would be behaviors, thoughts, or emotions significantly departing from social or cultural norms. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean evil, just departing from what is normal. Now, it can be interpreted that for things like antisocial behavior, but it might be something like mood disorder or eating disorders. Then we could think in terms of psychopathology. What do we mean by that? That would be a scientific study of mental disorders that encompass their development, their classification, and their treatment. So we can think in terms of what we've talked about in this course so far, just in this lecture. We've talked about ADHD, we've talked about depression, we've talked about dementia. Developmental psychology. What do we mean by that? Well, that is the scientific study of how and why people change over time. And this is going to include their physical change, their cognitive change, their emotional change, and their social development. And so a few things that we need to kind of be mindful within developmental psychology is that whole nature-nurture debate. We need to recognize that there are some critical periods in life for forming certain things, and that while there's continuity in the progression of things, there are times when there's discontinuity. That is, that there are specific stages where certain things happen and should happen. And then there's developmental psychopathology, which really examines the development of psychological disorders across the lifespan. And here we're integrating the biological, the psychological, and social factors, but being particularly mindful of the developmental factors that play into this as well. And I'm going to end with just a little question for you to kind of carry along as you go through this course. Which neurotransmitter is often implicated in both depression and anxiety? And I'll give you a hint. It's serotonin. And with that last hint, I will close out this lecture. I thank you so much for being a part of our first lecture in this course, and I look forward to engaging with you through the rest of the semester. You take care. Goodbye.